Morning, everybody. Welcome to House Education for February 24th. Just for the committee's scheduling purposes today, we're going to go into the lunch hour just to do a quick walkthrough at 12 on our miscellaneous ed bill. Shouldn't take more than a half an hour, and then we'll adjourn after that.
So I'll ratify the thing because I got to talk to the appropriations.
That's very important to go do. Okay, I'm actually going to turn over the moderating to the vice chair and to introduce our testimony and our topic.
All right. We are working this morning on the teacher workforce that we know is one of the absolute, if not biggest issues in our schools right now. And excited for a slate of testimony here of folks who are really deeply involved in the work of diversifying our teacher workforce. I think we'll hear from them. It's important to think about not just recruiting, but also retention of our workforce. I'm gonna put on my teacher hat for 30 seconds and ask everybody to do a short thought exercise, something we often do in professional development that I think is helpful in framing this, which is to think about what is the first time in your own experience you had an educator that was of the same race or ethnicity as you. For me, it's as far back as I can remember, preschool or kindergarten. And when is the first time you had an educator that was not of the same race or ethnicity as you? And for me, that was not until graduate school. So I just offer that as I think an important way to think about our own experiences. So Mike's going to start us off from the Vermont Principals Association, and then we've got some great testimony from folks doing hard work in the field.
Good morning. Thanks very much for having us. My name is Mike McGrath. I work as the Associate Executive Director at the Vermont Principals Association. And I'm going to plan to talk for about 10 minutes. And then I'm eager to turn it over to some of my colleagues who are visiting us through Zoom. It's not like I'm both screens, so I'm getting used to that. I want to thank you very much for just taking the testimony on diversifying the educator workforce. I've been paying attention to this issue closely for the last 4 or 5 years, and I've provided written testimony, which gives it's written in more of a report form, and it has a lot of details and a lot of links and a lot of resources if you want to see what other states are doing or example programs and all those things. It's fairly comprehensive, but I want to start my comments a little bit more from the heart. And just say that a lot of my perspectives, insights, and any kind of wisdom that I might be able to offer on this topic are informed heavily by people with more lived experience, specifically Bonnie Johnson Ayton, who's been an administrator and leader of color in Vermont schools for a long time. She works in the Burlington School District. Michaela Sims, who you will hear from later, and LaShawn Whitmore Sells, who's been a leader and educator in this work for a long time as well. In addition to that, I think that my perspective is greatly informed by my students, my former students, specifically Montpelier High School and the youth of color, the global majority there, who had incredible courage. I don't invoke this story very often or this part of my career very often because of the danger of a single story. But I was struck as I was walking across town here, thinking that it was over 5 years ago that the students led Montpelier High School in raising a Black Lives Matter flag. I was the principal at the time. It was the first time that a Black Lives Matter flag had gone up in a public school, as far as we know, in the country. That garnered attention around the world. And there was a lot of hate, which was sort of well documented. It's true that myself and a couple of the students were on the front page of Stormfront, which is essentially the KKK's website, for a few days. And it is also true, and I think more important, that we received hundreds, thousands of letters from young students around the country of the global majority thanking us and drawing beautiful pictures and saying how important this was in their lives. I received phone calls from people in their middle ages calling on their break from work at the airport in Tennessee, crying, saying thank you. Okay. And at that time, I knew that I was going to be committed to this work for the rest of my life. And one of the things that I realized in that moment when I looked around our staff was there were a lot of caring staff there, and there was not one single staff member that was a part of the global majority. Not one of us at Montpelier High School at that time. That's a problem. Okay, it's a long-standing problem in Vermont. We've had this issue for decades, forever, really. And we have not had the commitment to be able to address it in a serious way. So I have been trying to figure this out, right? I've been sort of trying to peel the onion. How can this be? How can we have 97% white teaching educator staff in our state? There are a lot of reasons. And what I started to learn is that this is not the first time that Vermont in the education world has attempted to diversify our educator workforce. Nationally, the educator workforce is 80% white. I already mentioned that in Vermont, it's 97%. And technically, when you look at the data, we're actually around, because the number is so small, the number of teachers who identify as Black is actually 0%. Well, it's not true. There are some educators who identify as Black in Vermont, but it's a very small number. And as I started to get into the issue, I learned, okay, people have tried this before. So that's one important thing. To different successes, different reasons why it hasn't worked. And the second thing that I learned is that there is work that's already happening. Right. And it's sort of a localized level. There are some districts that are working on recruitment and retention for diversifying the educator workforce. There are some people, like in their own agency, in their own capacity. Michaela is certainly one of those people. And I'm eager for you to hear from her. And essentially, as far as I know, there is no comprehensive or statewide investment or even responsibility in the state of Vermont for diversifying the educator workforce. And as far as I know, I don't think that there ever has been. There's no one concentrated on this. It's not a part of anyone's portfolio. It's not a part of anybody's job role. So what happens is there's all of these sort of just catch as catch can. Oh, did you hear that they're doing this? Or some little group started that, or a little investment in one thing or another. I've been participating in a New England regional consortium led by the Great Schools Partnership that's taking this on really directly in a New England kind of way. They have lots of resources. And what I'm learning is that we're behind New England in this. That Massachusetts has a statewide investment. Rhode Island has significant programming. And others are Connecticut as well, is more engaged in addressing this in their workforce. And the other thing I wanted to say is that it is well-known data in the educational research that all students, not just students of the global majority, all students do better, learn more, are more effective, more successful in school when they have educators of color in their school. All of them. The impact that it has on the students of color in particular is profound, right? The model that Aaron was invoking when we started. So it's very important that this impacts all of our students and that we recognize that there are programs, there are ways to do this, and that we essentially don't do any of them as a state. And I don't think we ever have. And I think that it's past time, but I would really encourage us to be serious about this. So I have some recommendations rather than just that, and I'll leave it at that and turn it over to someone else soon. In my write-up, I shared that I learned a few key things. One is that I mentioned that there have been attempts in the past. That two, there are some localized efforts, and three, that we haven't invested as a state. My recommendations are that we fundamentally start to record data. The data that we have is murky. I actually don't even know how the Great Schools Partnership has generated that data. I trust however it is that they did it, but I actually don't know how, because I don't think that schools, as far as I know, actually keep racialized demographic data, right? Like, for example, in the VPA, if you ask me the number of school administrators of color that the VPA has as members, we have around 800 members. We have an affinity space for our admin of color. I don't have anywhere where I can look up and say, oh, it's 12 this year, it was 14 last year. What happens, because there are so few, is I think of 9, 10 people, and then I say, oh, I think he's around 10, right? That's not data. So one of the things that we can do is actually begin to collect demographic data and explain why, right? Because there may be some uncomfortable feelings around that, but I think if we can recognize it's for advancing equity, then it's more comfortable. The second thing that I would ask folks to consider is to have a concentrated effort on this. I don't know what department, I don't know if it's the Department of Labor, I don't know if it's a task force, something, right, that holds this work, where there can be convenings and say, okay, this person did this, someone to connect the dots, right? There needs to be a person or a department or a task force that is paying attention to this long term, right? And then my third recommendation, I think you'll hear this from my colleagues here shortly from Zoom, is to attend to the environment. And one of the reasons that we have had recruitment challenges is because we have retention challenges. People have moved to Vermont or grown up in Vermont and experienced so much racism, either in a macro way or a micro way, and microaggressions or explicit racism, that they either move out of Vermont or they do not stay in Vermont. So we need to attend to the environment. And you might be thinking, well, how could we do that here in House Ed? I would say the last time I was here for testimony, I provided testimony on Act 1. Helping support a comprehensive implementation of Act 1, it would be a great way to attend to the environment. There are other things that you'll hear from my colleagues around the environment. And then there's the chance to incentivize the pathways. There are multiple pathways. One area that I would ask us to pay close attention to, based on investigating this and talking to lots of folks who have been at it for a while, is to think about the intersection between any kind of state agency, state leadership, college, universities, and districts. And if folks from those three areas can collaborate, there's the chance to both recruit and retain more educators of color in Vermont. One of the areas that we have been missing is that folks move to Vermont, go to college here, and then leave to go teach somewhere else, right? In a demographic that we sorely need for our students. So I'll leave it at that. We can do questions at the end? Yeah, okay. Thanks. Should I move or should I stay?
You can stay, yeah, why don't you stay there? And who, remind me, next is
Michaela.
Michaela, okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Welcome, Michaela. If you can just tell us who you are, your place in the educational landscape, and then we look forward to hearing your testimony.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Good.
My name is Michaela. I work in Southern Vermont in two capacities. I'm a teacher educator. I work with the Spark Teacher Education Social Justice Program. And also I do equity and social justice work in Windham Southeast Supervisory Union, which is Brattleboro and the surrounding towns. I've been here for quite a while. I'm one of the 0% of my reference. And I'll echo some of the things that he said, and I'll try not to be repetitive. If I'm repetitive, just raise your hand and just go like this. I respond well to that. You don't need the music. You can just cut me off. But I'll echo what he said in saying that this is about recruitment and retention. I think that retention is huge, that we've lost a lot of good educators from a variety of backgrounds, both during the pandemic and even way before the pandemic. A lot of this is because we need more just schools, just like we need a more just world. And I think that there are things that we all can do about that. in beating the drum and putting it first, centering equity in all the work we do and saying it over and over and over again. So it's not just a few of us saying that, it's all of us, and really putting into work to shift how we see the world, to shift how we're analyzing the current situation, and know that we can't just throw our hands up and say, this is a white state, what are we gonna do? There's a lot that we can do, and it's not a primarily white state. Vermont is changing right before our eyes, and we can see it in the schools especially. We see the numbers on the rise. We see kids in need. We see kids who are not seeing the reflection in the school system in which they exist. I was really touched. One of the things that I do in the schools is I have a student group for students of color, both middle school and high school. And the high school students were talking to the middle school students, and they were like, if you stick with AWARE, you'll learn that it's not just a group, it's a family. And so these kids have found that, but all our students need that family. School is where most of us spend our time. Those of us who work in school and those of us attend school. So we need to have a place of belonging for not just students, but also for staff. And that feeling of belonging comes from diversifying the workforce. Yes, that's part of it, but also increasing the idea that we can all work towards equity together. And so putting it just on the front of our tongues, I'm gonna say that again, there's a dissonance in this state between who we think we are and who we really are. And so people are like, oh, we feel good, we're kind and we're loving and we're welcoming to all people, but that's not the experience of all kids. I once explained to this young child who perpetrated harm by saying something racist to another student, and this is a poor white child. And I told him that it's like being tapped on the shoulder constantly, that racism is always there. It's always tapping us in the shoulder. And we're in such a society that what happens when you get fed up is you are the one that everyone's training their head to look at. When you've had enough, then you're the one that becomes the perpetrator very quickly. And because the society is so racist, often these are the children who get in trouble. These are the kids on behavior plans. And it's not even recognized that it's coming from their experience. And the policy in place does not heal that harm. And so we have to work on looking at how do we humanize every situation in a school? How do we humanize all interactions, including ones for a child who is a perpetrator of racism and the other child who's a recipient, and knowing that it's not just one-on-one, that everyone in the environment suffers when that kind of things happens. So the hope is that we're challenged not by just creating a more just world through outcomes to say what happened, but also the process. So how we get there matters, and who's at the table when we get there matters too. So we're hoping to look at around the table and not invisibilize the people that we really need there to do this work. So often that's what happens to us, is that we're pushed to the side for other more important efforts, or the efforts become diluted by the broad focus of all the work we have to do, which we know is great. So again, the hope is that we can transform schools to a welcoming environment for all students. And one thing that's really important is restorative and transformative practices for adults and students, not just the focus on like, what are the students doing, but adults in the buildings, we need to be connected. And over the years, one of the things that we started in our school district and expanded statewide was the Educators of Color group. And so now we have a statewide group that meets. And in terms of data, just to echo that, we have no way of getting in touch with all the teachers of color. Teachers could come in the state and leave the state without us even knowing it. And people are scared to collect data about people of color, except like at the doctor's office. I guess that's the only place that they feel comfortable asking. But that itself is a huge barrier. It's a barrier because the idea that you can't talk about race as a verboten subject is a racist ideology itself. We need to be able to say things. We need to be able to ask questions. That idea that we can't talk about it, that we're all colorblind, is one that hurts everyone. We're not colorblind. Everybody can clearly see, I'm Black. It's not a secret, but people are scared to mention it, are scared to ask questions. But we need to start doing that in order to make connections. And like what Mike said, I'm gonna echo that, to say why we're asking these questions, to say we're trying to make a welcoming community. We need to keep track of why you're staying. Also, we need to check in with teachers and say, like, how is your experience going? One of, I call it one of my fantasy attempts would be to have money and a lot of support to have almost like our own internal AmeriCorps, like a Vermont Corps for teachers of color specifically, and recruit them in their college years. When some teachers actually, some end up being counseled out depending on how they test, because testing is huge and that is shifting in the AOE, but there's still a lot of testing that happens. But getting a hold of teachers in their variety of disciplines, that's the word, in their junior year of college, and offering them support in testing, offering them mentorship, a Vermont teacher of color, offering them loan forgiveness, working with colleges for tuition reductions, and reduction in fees for their license in exchange for a commitment for them to teach in the state for 3 years, and hoping that they'll stay. And the help for teachers, typically is 5 years. I mean, I feel that seems a little long, but I feel like if we get them for 3 years, if they love it, if they're called to it, they'll stay, especially if we have all the right support. One of the things that you don't get is a lot of support. Most districts have their own mentorship program, but it's not specific. They're not looking at your identity or hooking you up with a teacher with similar interests. The other thing is just the beating the drum of the importance of public education. We're one of the few states that doesn't have charter schools, which I think is huge and it's a great thing to have, but I think it's a noticeable thing, and hoping that our focus on public education and diversifying the workforce will keep our students in the public schools. I've seen a huge exodus of kids even to the private schools in the state. Like, how do we keep them here? By offering them the programs and the reflections of themselves that they need to be successful. And the same is for the teachers, to offer us the professional environment that we need, the growth that we need to encourage teachers to not only stay in their positions, but also to become leaders in the school. I think that one of the challenges is that it's really, you're kind of invisibilized as a person of color. And as I move around in my school and take on more of a leadership role, I'm constantly under fire to stand up for myself. And it's exhausting. And because there are not a lot of people who have my back. And so if you in that room, one of the hugest asks is that any work you do towards equity in schools is not just having my back, the back of all the educators of color in the state, it's having the back of all the students in the state. As you know, students do better when they're reflected in their school environment, but also social justice education is something that's a huge, no matter who delivers it, is a huge benefit of all students, giving them the tools to analyze the world they live in, giving them the tools to understand how we got here and where we want to go. So I'm hoping that y'all focus on equity and you can be be in solidarity with me and all the students that I work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I think we're going to Jonathan next. Is that right? Okay. All right. Jonathan, again, if you can introduce yourself. You have an interesting geographic location and perspective too that I think will be helpful to us. So welcome.
So good morning. My name is Jonathan Phipps. I am the equity coordinator for the Southwest Vermont Supervisory Union. I've been in this position for 2 years. I'm also a member of the Vermont Educational Equity Collective, or VEEC for short, which is a coalition of DEI educational professionals throughout the state of Vermont. I too am in Southern Vermont, along with Ms. Sims. We are primarily centered out of Bennington, Vermont. So I first want to start off by thanking everyone, making sure everyone can hear me. If not, just tell me to speak up. Nobody's ever told me I'm quiet in my life. I'm typically a loud person, but that's okay. And I will try my best to not repeat things. But I do want to start by reading a letter from 2 students of our own Mount Anthony Union High School. These 2 students are not the typical honor roll students that everybody tends to represent in committees such as this, or forums such as this. These 2 students are just 2 students at our high school. I first read this letter in 2022 at the Southern Vermont Economic Forum when we were discussing inclusive employment. And I'll start. So this is them. We have been asked to give a testimonial on why we feel it is important to have more educators of color employed by our school district here at Southwest Vermont Supervisory Union. Whenever I say SVSU for now, it'll be in reference to us, in Bennington, Vermont. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Bennington County's population is 95.5% white. When you are a kid of color growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, attending school at a predominantly white school, you feel out of place and like you don't belong. When and if there is a larger effort to hire and employ more teachers of color and staff of color and students of color here at SVSU will have adults to look to as role models and have better connections with adults that truly understand what they might be going through. If we have more educators and school personnel of color within our school system, students of color will feel more welcome and accepted and know that their cultural beliefs and values are appreciated. Growing up is hard enough, let alone having to grow up somewhere where you feel like an outsider and where you don't always belong. All students, not just students of color, deserve the opportunity to learn from educators made up of diverse backgrounds. We would like to end on a quote that is meaningful and impactful, and something that we believe holds an extreme amount of value. According to, and I'm going to butcher the name, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, a diverse mix of voices leads to better discussions, decisions, and outcomes for everyone. As two students in the SVSU, we urge this district to make larger efforts around hiring practices that promote diversity and inclusion so that our discussions, decisions, and outcomes within the SVSU can become better. Thank you for listening. So there's a reason why I started off with that, because that is really what we're talking about, is trying to make the best impact for all of our students, not just students of color, but all of them. So I'm going to just give you a bit of a brief rundown of what we at the SVSU have done, the scope and scale of the issue for us. So we are an SU in the state that is made up of 10 schools, roughly 3,500 students, all throughout Bennington County. Currently, as of this moment, we have over 50 employment vacancies. Of those 50, 20 of them are teaching position vacancies. 10% of the student population within our school district is not white and or a member of the global majority. When you hear people saying global majority, just for clarification, we're talking about what some people would say BIPOC or non-white. This is not reflected in our staffing. I don't know of a single place in the state where it is reflected in their staffing. And our staffing is of roughly 800 employees. Furthermore, our community is one that qualifies for universal free meal. Approximately 25% of our community is officially below the poverty line. And as previously stated, research has shown that diverse and representative education staff are actually more capable and effective when working within this dynamic than a monolithic one. It is well documented how representation in staffing and educators has a beneficial impact on student performance and school climate. I am a personal testament to this. I can remember as being a young Black youth, sometimes I literally just needed a Black educator to get my legitimate points across. I went to elementary school in a predominantly white elementary school. However, we did have a Black administrator. And I remember Mr. Gill, when I was going through something, and my mom, who also worked on staff, would be the two people I would have to go to be like, hey, this is happening. Now, the SVSU has heard this, and we fully know and acknowledge this. And we know that this is something we have to address to be an effective and effectual education system. So, in early 2022, the SVSU and its community, the wider community, met at our monthly Equity Advisory Committee meetings that we do have. The goal for this one meeting was to propose strategies on how to attract a more representative staff. We came up with some ideas. I'm just going to run you through them. The first and most obvious idea, one that pretty much every school district has probably tried, is we decided to reach out to the 10 closest proximity HBCUs on establishing a graduate pipeline. This is a very standard effort. Honestly, we didn't get any response from any of the schools, but it was worth a try. We didn't stop there. We considered hiring a school university cohort model. Cohort model, instead of basically taking one or two prospective educators from a school, we're taking a whole cohort of 4 or 5. That's simply put. We are still attempting this, but it is exceedingly difficult as a sole supervisory union to attract 2 educators from a university, let alone a whole cohort. We still hold this idea to have some promise as it creates an innate support structure, a sense of familiarity, and possibly even a sense of community for new employees. However, the difficulty of investment for as we really undertake this effort is immense. Didn't stop there though. One of the more interesting ones is we attempted to reach out to both AmeriCorps and Teach for America on the prospect of partnering with the SBSU. We were essentially laughed off stage, really, and I'm not going to exaggerate that. Basically, it boiled down to the two yahoos, another one who was also on the meeting with me, Nick Galt, who was our director of human resources. We didn't hold enough weight. We just didn't matter enough. We're not large enough, even though we are one of the larger supervisory unions in the state of Vermont. However, we did think that maybe state officials would hold enough weight. That's going to be a subtle hint for later. We looked into the possibility of creating a bridging program to help pairs become fully fledged teachers. This was actually a very promising effort. However, the initial cost estimate we conducted for attempting this bridging program with a mere 5 employees, of which we would always have a permanent earmarking for 2 to 3 of them to be from underrepresented populations, it was very high. We still hold this to be a good idea if it can be substantially financed and sustainably financed and budgeted somehow. Again, another subtle hint to the state. As you can see, a lot of our efforts, our biggest enemy was cost and scale of the problem, as well as our own personal small scale in relation to others. This was the largest hindrance. Also, another hindrance that goes undiscussed often is we as a state and education bodies, we kind of don't do ourselves favors. We are over 100 school districts and supervisory unions divided up among a small population of roughly 650,000 people. We are also competing directly against each other. That seldom yields positive results, especially when you're also directly competing against more unified, larger, organized, and resourced competition, such as New York, Massachusetts, etc. So, what do? Well, we still have some ideas. We're always full of ideas. Ideas we feel that the state can move forward that may actually help us attract a more representational staff. Aside from the obvious ones in which you're probably going to hear 1,000 times, addressing the issue of housing, salary increases, better statewide infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to hear this a lot probably. We have other ones. An idea that we thought about was offering relocation packages. $10,000 of a relocation package / bonus to offer students and professionals from out of state to move into Vermont to teach. Vermont is literally the second least diverse state within the union. Drawing from any other state immediately means, by definition, we are drawing from a more diverse pocket or pool. Other professions in Vermont actually currently enjoy such an incentive or such a package through grants or other mechanisms. So why not educate? Another idea we came up with is an idea for tax rebates for teachers. Being able to yearly rebate state income tax for new teachers in Vermont would make the position attractive from out of state. Example given. Imagine if you're a Vermont new teacher in your first 3 or 5 or whatever amount of years of employment as a teacher within the state of Vermont, the state income tax will be rebated back to you. This mechanism is both yearly, accountable, and trackable. It may attract educators into the state. After all, over $1,000 a year extra in your pocket is no joke. It's no laughing matter. It might actually help them find accommodation, housing. It might actually help other problems too. Finally, another idea, or another couple ideas that we had was basically, well, as an SU, we could not draw any interest or even re-engage with TSA or AmeriCorps. I would imagine the state of Vermont can. Now, I will admit, as a former Baltimore City public school teacher, I have a bias against these sort of things. However, if you do want to infuse new young educators from a potentially diverse set of backgrounds, as any TSA, Teach for America, or AmeriCorps candidate pool would be far more diverse than Vermont is, well, it's worth looking into. Let's look at it this way. Teach for America alone has over 50,000 educators placed in schools nationwide. There are a multitude of sites in which Teach for America operates, including entire ruralized states such as Idaho, South Dakota, Alabama, Colorado. They already have an apparatus in which they utilize TFA or AmeriCorps to infuse their systems with new educators, new diverse educators as well. Many other states in our immediate vicinity are already utilizing these very resources, such as Massachusetts, you have heard prior to, and even Connecticut, which is coming online in 2024 with this. For us to not utilize this, or at least to investigate it, in my opinion, is kind of, well, I don't think that's a good idea. We should at least look into this prospect. And truthfully, I believe if the state board and the agency of education were to put their name behind it, it would hold a lot more weight than individual school districts or supervisory unions. Another idea we came up with is providing resource support and or coordination for SUs and districts attempting to create bridging programs so that the cost and investment to do so is not prohibitively high or complex. We would love for a centralized effort by the state to allow every supervisory union and or district to create its own bridging program with the support of the state. This would allow us to take our already diverse parent population, which we are actively trying to engage with, and help make them full-blown educators, allowing us to continually hire more and more people. But that only happens when it's actually a larger effort than just an individual school district or supervisory whose resource pool is innately smaller. Finally, another idea that we can come up with, and if you have any questions on this one, I will have to divert to our HR coordinator, Nick Galt, our HR director, Nick Galt, who is immensely big with expertise on this, is reducing barriers in fiscal costs for employment and licensure from neighboring states and alternative pathways. This would allow us to draw in a more diverse population by itself. So, all these ideas, let's supposedly do all of them. We still have a problem already, and everybody did say it already, retention. Any effort implemented will mean nothing if we cannot retain and support both current and new staff. The best way to do this is honestly to establish a culture of community, support, and my favorite A word of the world, accountability. How do we do this? Well, one of the things we could easily do is fully implement and resource school climate initiatives and policies that are already in place. Currently, any feeling of accountability in this regard is bad enough for the employee. But for employees from marginalized groups, feelings of unaccountability are far worse. I will speak from personal experience. If you are a person that is an odd person out in any group, and you notice that the group is not accountable to itself, and there is no way of accountability being tracked, you immediately will get nervous because it's very easy for you to become a target. The biggest example I could utilize for this that is currently active, all equity coordinators such as myself, is our state's current HH policy for harassment, hazing, and bullying. I challenge you currently. We want to talk about data. Let's go into the AOE's database that is supposed to be tracking and inputting HHB policy. Look it up. It's on the AOE. The last data pool that they had is actually from 2017. That is 6 years out of date. Now, as a person who has two sons who are like me, the idea that like we don't provide centralized training or we don't provide any actual fiscal resources and make sure our districts and supervisory unions can properly implement this crucial policy that is directed to improving climate, making sure our most vulnerable students are protected from harassment is frightening to me. I'm going to compare it to our neighboring state. I live in Troy, New York. We have DASA, D-A-S-A, Dignity for All Students Act. The way, if we were to compare DASA to our HHB policy, we fall horrendously short in Vermont. For example, in DASA, school systems are required to be accredited and retrained every so often. I think it's 2 to 3 years. There are accredited trainers they have to go to. Those trainers have to go through a process to become accredited for DASA training. We don't have that here. We have a couple. Having oversight and accountability naturally makes families and employees feel safer, thus more likely to stay in Vermont and thus more likely to flourish in Vermont. Another idea for retention is fully implement and provide proper resource, oversight, and training again to ensure that workplace harassment, bullying, and discrimination laws already in place are totally followed. Again, This is another problem that mirrors the prior one. Finally, another thing that we can do to pay better attention is actually invest in these systems and these trainings and oversight mechanisms. Those two things that I mentioned prior really are not effective at all. They don't have any investment teeth or fidelity behind them. An easiest example that I will die on a hill for is how many school districts in Vermont utilize case management software to track HHB, Title IX, Rule 4500, or even workplace disputes and discrimination cases. Workplace software, case management software is an immense tool that could be a force multiplier for administrative staff and systems. And in reality, it's not that large of an investment at a state level. For a school system such as myself or ourselves, I looked into the costing for how much it would do to have 30 accounts to actually fully cover it. It would have been around $25,000 or $20,000. Most school systems are not as large as us. So let's just say it's 10,000 or so. Do 10,000 times 100 or so school systems, $1 million a year to make sure that our school systems are accountable and the data that is tracked for harassment and discrimination claims is clearly there, and we can keep those people accountable. That is worth its weight in gold, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. So, what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, we, the state of Vermont, and supervisory unions, truthfully, we don't even have to reinvent the wheel. Well, we don't even have to invent anything, really. We just have the state have to actually try with fidelity and effort to do what is already out there and in existence. Having a representative and diverse and fully staffed education system is too important of a social and public good to not attempt any of these ideas. It is also too important to leave it up to individual school districts or supervisory unions to address. We may not all be successful, and we may not have all the same capacity. Together, we're strong. Independently, we're limited. Individual school districts and supervisory unions will continue to struggle if left to take on this immensely challenging and extremely important task by themselves. We are trying, but there are limitations that we are running into. It all comes down to this. My personal concept that I love to say all the time, institutional prioritization. Only in this case, it's of the state. If the state deems this goal important enough and holds it high enough in a priority, we can address this challenge. We can meet this challenge. However, if we don't, well, we'll be having this exact same conversation in 5, maybe 10 years, over and over again. If we do not hold this goal to be a priority, we will fail the state of Vermont and its people for decades to come. We will fail them educationally, we will fail them economically, we will fail them socially, and we will fail them culturally. I imagine that is not something we all want to do. So with that, I'm going to end. I thank you for your time, and I really, really hope that we can figure out something going forward.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And Nick, do you have separate testimony?
I have something I can add briefly. I don't want to.
Awesome. Thank you.
I don't want to reiterate anything
Okay.
that Jonathan shared. We've worked closely together on these efforts the last few years. I only wanted to reiterate that what we believe is needed is a concerted statewide effort. There are people positioned throughout the state in our school districts who are ready and willing to do this work. They have ideas, they are trying, but they are stymied by their lack of size, their lack of resources, whether that be funding, time, knowledge, leverage. A statewide effort that would be sponsored and backed by the Agency of Education, the state legislature, that could help us better utilize our collective resources. We could consolidate our individual efforts, our time, our knowledge, our ideas. As a state, we have a significantly better chance of succeeding than as isolated districts making our own efforts on a small scale. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. We can pool our resources, pool our ideas, and make statewide efforts that we can't. Jonathan's example of Teach for America, ambitious, but for a small district like us, I can understand why no one took us seriously. We could barely get on the phone with anybody. As an agency of education for a state backed by the legislature, that holds weight, that holds leverage, that would enable us to do things we can't do on our own. That's all I would add.
Thank you so much. I think we probably have some questions here, so I want to give folks time to ask questions.
This is, it's really challenging, and I keep sort of coming back in my mind that this is probably kind of economics in terms of supply and demand, but I also think that that brings up it has in my mind brought up some moral questions. So I have a son who taught in north of Chicago for 7 years, 90% students of color, 95% teachers who were white. And the whole time he was there, and they could draw from a sort of richer pool of applicants, they were really just unable to move the needle. And it's hard to think of a more needy district to diversify its teaching population than a place like that. At the same time, as a school board member here, our district, whose complexion really has not changed over the years, we felt very strongly about also needing to diversify our people working. And it brought up the point that I think, Jonathan, you were speaking to, and that is we are working against one another. And I couldn't help but feeling like, if we work hard to diversify the workforce, we're hurting perhaps a district for which it would be a better thing to have a more diverse workforce. And I guess I suspect it really all comes down to the pipeline of teachers, which I'm not necessarily sure we can contribute to here as well. But I don't know, if you just sort of comment on I found myself very hard to think about successfully moving the needle. And Jonathan, you've certainly come up against many roadblocks as you've tried to do the same thing. But I guess if you could sort of talk, if you do a statewide effort, do you see that there is areas that you have to focus that effort someplace over another place?
So there's two thoughts I have with that. Like, one is statewide efforts that be better, because then we could actually whether that's needed. However, I also am a firm believer in that diversity is not just for helping the diverse. I use this example oftentimes when I'm in our schools. People often will say, erroneously, what is the point of punishing or addressing this issue when the challenge happened in a classroom that was all white? Well, there is an actual real cost. And I use this example all the time. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. I believe Nick is also originally from the same area. That's why we get along so well. So let's say in Vermont, a student says something in a classroom, and all his cohorts are white, so no big harm, right? We should not address it, we should not have a diverse death there or anything like that. Well, the problem is, suppose that student is brilliant and gets accepted into Johns Hopkins University, has to move down to Baltimore, Maryland, and now has that lack of knowledge and that belief pattern in his or her expectation, and brings that to that neck of the woods. Odds are that situation is not going to end well. So what I'm saying is this: I think you want diversity, yes, where you need it most, but you also want it even in districts such as yourself, because in that way, those students in that district can actually understand, learn, adapt, and even take in exchange ideas and discussions with the people from different cultures, different demographics, and thus they're better equipped to handle the United States of the 21st century, which is we're multicultural. We have to get used to that. So I don't want to make it so that we want to just make it like a statewide effort where we have 10 people of need in this district and 5 in this district. It needs to be a concerted effort that is universally throughout the state. And wherever they fall is where they fall, in my opinion, because if it's a universally concerted effort within the state, we all will benefit regardless. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but is that?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I would say that we really need to track districts that are doing concerted efforts for social justice work and making an environment possible for teachers of colors to thrive. And so that's maybe where I would place the emphasis more on any particular geographic location, that people need a lot of support. Even teachers that are white that are doing social justice work need to a lot of support. And so I didn't quite understand the moral dilemma. Was the moral dilemma that there needed other places more than?
Given the small supply of teachers out there, period, much less teachers of color, I sort of, as a school board member, said, our district, which is very, very white, and Burlington, which is not, I sort of was wondering in my mind, like, well, who sort of deserves to win the arms race for who, can recruit the teacher? And, that's where I was coming from.
I don't think we should frame it as an arms race. I think we should frame it as a collaborative effort. Because if we I'm really meaning this. If one district wins the race, then yes, we all suffer. But if we all attempt together and we basically share the resources and full knowledge and capability, we all benefit. No district in Vermont, regardless of how monolithic and demographic it is going to benefit from not having a diverse staff. None. Those students are going to be at a disadvantage in the 21st century in not ever having to experience a diverse educator or an education from another population set. That is a damage being done to a youth. I think we need to frame it as like, we want this to happen universally throughout the whole entire state of Vermont. Because if we don't, we are just creating students that will grow up to be adults that are lacking in a fundamental linchpin of knowledge they will need to thrive in the 21st century United States. Or even in the 21st century Vermont.
I see it a little differently. I mean, I went to Detroit a few years ago, and one of the magical things about Detroit was that there are schools where all the teachers are Black. And there's so many towns that are mostly people of color that still all the teachers are white. And one of the things that they had that we're still working on is young people who had an amazing experience in those schools. Like the teachers that I met, most of them had graduated from the school where they were currently teaching. And so really focusing on the school environment, looking at Act One, looking at things that strengthen the schools from the ground up. One of the things that I worked on in our district is we have equity teacher leaders in every school. And that's really helped to shift the focus on equity. It's not just dispersed, like I'm a district-wide employee, but there are 2 employees on the ground that are responsible for staff meetings and questions that come up in the classroom so that they're peers that they can ask. So I think that in really increasing students' ability to make connections in the school matters. And in terms of who gets the teachers, I think to me, it's really the effort of really building up our connection to each other and humanizing each other the best we can in schools, which is really more challenging than it sounds just because of the bureaucracy.
Representative Stone?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Representative Mary Catherine Abdel Ghani Stone, and I say that because I grew up in Alabama as an Egyptian American. And the first time I had a teacher who looked like me, it was when I was in college and my dad was teaching me. So this work is important and valuable, and I just want to thank you. I wanted to jump off what you said, Ghani. Do you feel like that would help potentially recruit other people to come to Addison County so that the makeup of the classrooms and the workforce would change? And another question, totally related but unrelated. Michaela, I was wondering if you could speak about the Vermont Education of Color Spring Retreat being put on by the Vermont Professionals of Color. I know that you have a big role in that. If you could just talk about what that retreat is and what you hope to accomplish.
We have some asks and a document that we created that we worked on together that we're trying to move along and we want this group to be seen as a place for professional development. So it's a place we come together, we talk about our struggles, but we also just kick back because we all need the support and the time because there's so many things asked of us. And I feel like that's the commonality, is that when there's a challenge with a certain situation, we're called on. And it doesn't matter if you're a para-educator, this is for any, and we use the word educator really broadly as anyone who works in the school. Because we want to really be inclusive in that way. And so all people are invited. And the hope is to have a support network so that people are able to stay in the state, like your father would be welcome. And so we are hoping that we have a big mailing list, and not everyone shows up all the time because everyone's so overworked. But we have a retreat in the fall and one in the spring. We provide as much support as possible for people to come there. So that means paying mileage, paying for lodging, and food is provided, childcare is provided, because we want people to come and just be and not have things asked of them. And so We create the agenda as we go, and it's really a place of support, and we're hoping.
Yes, I wondered if anybody has any data on the amount of diversity in our college system currently. So in our state university and colleges, what is the diversity ratio? Do we know?
It's a great question. I don't know. Does anyone else?
We could certainly ask them that, particularly if you look at their budget requests.
So I'm just thinking of like, if we're trying to recruit from them, well, what are we recruiting from?
Yep.
I would say that I know one thing is that it's at least reflective of what the high schools have, because so many of my kids, students that graduate, my aware students, they almost all of them go to school in state. A lot of them do. So because that's often the least expensive. So we have a lot of students that go to UVM, and they struggle there too. So I'm not going to say it's diverse. It's also a bigger institution, but there are the students there though. And to me, even if it's 5% or whatever the percentage is, it's really the numbers and the need. And so even if we're recruiting from there, and we get a cohort of 5, that's huge. And I think that the other thing is that because we're such a small state, it doesn't take a lot to make an impact. It really doesn't. And so whatever efforts we have, and it's true, like Jonathan, we've had a lot of failed efforts, but we don't stop trying because of that. It's really important and yeah, anything helps at this point. That's where we're at.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee?
Oh, you didn't get, Mary Catherine, right? I don't think anyone addressed your first question, which was like, if someone moves to Addison County, does that potentially, I don't know it definitively, but based on my conversations with a lot of folks, including Michaela and Jonathan, I think what's important is to be honest with any potential candidate, that if we're going to recruit from outside of the state and say, come to Vermont, there's a lot of things to celebrate about being an educator in Vermont. There's a lot of flexibility. There's the opportunity to provide a
situation like that. The biggest asset that any system or school district could have is a good system of accountability and making sure that those staff know that they're supported and protected from any negative ill effects. That requires the state, the school system, everybody to basically take this as a top priority thing and really invest in it. Take the time to understand, hey, person coming into a situation in which we need to make sure this individual is actually, well, not only protected, but also supported. If we don't do that, it's bad for retention. Like, you have to do that. It has to be a paramount issue. If it's not, then you're not really solving a problem.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, sure.
What I think about too is that there's so many advertisements like come ski in Vermont, come do this in Vermont. The other thing is that if we have a system that teachers get free schooling and for teaching in Vermont, people will come teach in Vermont. Like there's advertisements for the Army. The National Guard comes to our school and lands helicopters. I don't even know how much money that costs. Like, get people to come and teach, come be a teacher. We don't want the helicopters and all that fancy stuff. It's like, what is it? How do we get kids to love school? And I think that is part of it. It's like the passion. Like, my job is hard and I love it. And there are very few people I think that would stick to it, because there have been years where I look at that building and I do not want to go in. And I wish I would say that wasn't true, but there are years that is that bad. But when I see those students and I hear them say that Aware is like a family, it tugs at my heart. It's like, this is why I'm here. And so I think that there are a lot of people in the world like that. Obviously, you're sitting in this room, you care about education. So if we pour into it, we will get rewards. When we pour into these children, we get rewards. It can happen. We can do it. And I think that a lot of the negativity is like, oh, we're so white. Oh, it's just, we're not that white. It kind of, when we think like that, we also erase so many children's experiences, so many people's lives. There's so many of us here. We're here for the long haul. We love these children, all the children, and we just need more of it, obviously, because they got 50 vacancies. That ain't good. All right, thank you.
I think Michaela's comments are probably a perfect place to wrap up. And I just point our committee to Mike's written testimony, a lot of links, a lot of resources for those who want to dig in a little more. Hopefully a sort of comprehensive teacher workforce bill that Rep. McCann and Rep. Taylor and I worked on with some folks from Commerce will be introduced early next week. And it addresses some of these things, but I think gives us stuff to think about as we dig into the different kind of buckets of ways to address the teacher pipeline issues, and some new ideas for me here today, and certainly wonderful to have all of you as resources in trying to do this at the policy level. So thank you so much for your time and your dedication.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Want to keep going?
Sure. Are we going straight into bond bank? Okay. Our next testimony is from the Vermont Bond Bank as we think construction, or what I want to think of as a school transformation possibility moving forward in Vermont that probably touches the edges of some of the things we just heard in the last hour. And the future of public education in Vermont.
Hey, how's it going?
All right, welcome. Introduce yourself for the record.
Yes, I will. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to pull up the presentation, which I think all of you have.
Yeah, we have it on.
All right, I didn't see it there.
You guys have it. I do not have it memorized yet, so.
Look at that Senate Education Committee.
Yeah, we can all pull it up on our.
Okay, now I can follow along. Terrific. So thanks so much for having me. I'm Michael Gahn. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank. I'm also the executive director of the Vermont Educational and Health Buildings Financing Agency, which is another instrumentality like the bond bank with the purpose of providing access to tax-exempt finance. So I don't like to forget that organization, but you can never wear just one hat in the state, as you all know quite well. So I should also say I'm a father of 3 children, from 5.5 to 4 months old. So this is acutely relevant for me as well. So last time I was in this committee, the room was much smaller, and it was 2020, February. And we were having kind of a really good conversation about, the facility needs at that time. There was the South Burlington project that had popped up, as well as Burlington and Winooski was still in the works. And that had obviously brought people's attention to this subject. So fast forward to today, we're still in the conversation. And now, thanks to your work, I'm happy we're having this on the eve of finding out the results from the facility study, because it's clearly a large issue. On slide 2 here, one of the reasons we know it to be a large issue, and this is something we'd shared back in 2020, was that the bond bank sort of raison d'etre, its reason for being created was school finance, school construction finance. There had been a lot of short-term borrowing to do school construction in the 60s. And there was kind of a little bit of a capital crunch for long-term financing. And so that was the genesis of the creation of the bond bank. We were the first in the country, and really catalyzed by school construction financing needs. So our first largest, I skipped some of the punchline in my presentation, but our largest deal on an inflation adjusted basis was actually our first in 1970. And now 52 years later, no surprises, those facilities that we financed are more or less reaching the end of their useful lives. So just to give you a sense of where things are in our portfolio right now, our pooled loan portfolio, I should mention we also do work with we're the financial administrator of the state's clean water and drinking water revolving loan program as it relates to municipalities. But the pooled loan program, which is the core of our activities, is currently about $530 million outstanding. Of that, 33% or $173 million is for school districts. So as we think about potential needs in the billions, that gives you a sense of where we are right now. So obviously a dramatic increase in potential debt issuance. So slide 3, we're fortunate in that, the bond bank has such a high percentage of the loan facilities historically that we have good records on what construction finance has looked like. So slide 3 is in nominal dollars, so dollars that are not adjusted for inflation, the amounts of loans that we have made over the last 52 years or so. We also got information from JFO back in 2020 when I first was giving this presentation as the amounts of state aid per year. And so that's the small green amounts that you see on this graph. And then I've also added in the Winooski authorization. They're still in the construction phase, so they haven't moved to permanent financing, but nevertheless, that was the year they authorized. And then more recently, the Burlington authorization this past year in November. Kind of big observations here. The bond bank over this time period has made a little over 800 million in loans, total activity of 1.3 billion. Including the 200 million associated with Winooski and Burlington. Of that bond bank loans, about 61%, state aid accounts for about 22%. So just to give you some relative values there. But honestly, I think that the next slide, on slide 4, is more illustrative. It brings dollars into today's dollars using Northeast Urban CPI. So it's more of a fair comparison. And you see there that true to what I was discussing before, our largest bond issuance in today's dollars is about 270 million. And our largest issuance in our history. And then more recently, these are, with Winooski and Burlington, these are clearly large numbers, but it gives you some sense of scale as compared to historic numbers. What is notable in this is I haven't indexed it to construction costs, which I think most people would tell you that's going to be a lot higher. In 1970, in some cases, people were still using lead paint. PCBs hadn't even been invented, so things are a lot different on the construction front side. But just in terms of like actual dollars, it's just one measure to try and index things. So what I used to do in 2020 was sort of break out this by decade, and really there were some like clear patterns. The 70s were a clear time of a lot of activity. The 90s were much before my time, but I understand this to be a time when the technical schools were being developed. And then more recently, we're clearly in a new period of activity. Noticeable trends is, particularly post 2020, I think folks were very busy with COVID and also trying to figure out what was going to go on here with regards to potential for state aid or other things. And then in some cases, trying to get bonds passed and having those votes fail. So in inflation adjusted dollars, we've made about 1.69 billion over the last 52 years, total activity of 2.4 billion, 21% of which was historically state aid. So that gives you a sense of what we've done historically, looking out in the universe. I know you all have talked to Rhode Island a bit, and I've spoken with my kind of equivalent there for a financing agency to get a sense of what they do. But one thing that we do, the bond bank, every year is we do portfolio monitoring just like a bank would or any other kind of lender. So we're taking in financial reports, we're pulling down the data and creating medians that are unique to Vermont. And so that allows us then to take those medians, one, as a helpful tool for our communities to do financial planning, but also then to make comparisons outside of the state. So financial medians are the benchmarks that the rating agencies use nationally to measure financial health or where people stand on a relative basis. And I think one that really stands out is the one that I've highlighted here, which is that there's some selection bias here, like Moody's is only looking at entities that are taking out debt for the most part, but then they are doing annual monitoring. But amongst all of their school district medians, median long-term debt outstanding is 33.97 million. And then if you sort of drill down into A-rated schools with enrollment between 1,000 and 5,000 students, they have a median amount of debt of 25 million outstanding, which that doesn't look too different from a lot of our districts actually after consolidation. So compare that to our median, it's 1.67 million. And you have debt service as a percent of revenue of only 1.9% versus 5.9% in that same peer group. So that clearly tells you that our levels of capital investment are much different from national medians. Similarly, if you look at the capital asset depreciation ratio, which is some of the initial findings that came out of, that was sort of the first pass at the assessment study that's going on right now. National medians around mid 40s, and I think ours was like 60 or it was 70 or something like that. It came up in the conversation with Rhode Island. Rhode Island mentioned they look at 65% for facility replacement. So another indicator of sort of where we stand on the facilities question. So moving on from historical activities.
Pause.
Oh yeah, sure.
And just, I want to let what you had just said sink in and make sure I understand it. What you're saying is that our median is much lower, which reflects a lot less capital investment. You said our capital investment is much different.
Yeah.
Meaning it's much less.
Right. I mean, the median could be, they could be doing it out of pocket, right? I mean, like you could be using pay as you go as a method to pay for capital, obviously. But I suspect that that's not the case. So I think the way we read this based on our experience is that most capital is debt financed. And if we're not seeing it in our medians, then it's not occurring. And therefore the significant capital reinvestment is not occurring. Any other questions?
Well, I guess, and therefore our debt service at 1.9% is also reflects that much lower capital investment.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we take pride in getting folks a really low cost of capital, but it's not that low. So, and I did provide JFO. I listened in on, I think, one of your sessions, but I apologize if it wasn't your committee. There was a question from somebody, it might have been Ways and Means, a question from somebody about, okay, like what amount of the ed fund is spent on debt service? And we can actually help inform that number by just looking at our annual debt service. And so I shared that with JFO. What we don't include that would be material is the Winooski project, but they aren't quite in a long-term debt. They're still in the finishing up the construction phase. And I can't remember offhand what that number was, so I apologize. But I think notably the average weighted cost of capital for our remaining debt is about 3.5%. So we're doing our best to keep costs really, really low, and that includes the flexibility to achieve refunding savings or refinancing savings over time as well. So I think part of your discussion with Rhode Island started to venture into like how does the debt work that's associated with schools and how is that supported by the state? And so because the bond bank is really the instrument through which the state support of school districts as well as other units of government occurs, looking at our structure informs how the state support works for schools overall. So there's really three big buckets. One is we have really strong legal protections to protect ourselves and ensure that borrowers are repaying. So we have protections above and beyond what a private lender would have. Two and three are we have access to the state's moral obligation, like other instrumentalities of the state. So the way that works is that it's effectuated by a debt service reserve fund in our bonds. Because our borrowers can't repay us, if we can't then pay bondholders, our board chair writes a note to the governor. The governor then recommends to all of you that you backfill the debt service reserve fund with an appropriation. Obviously, it's never been used, but it is a very strong, and this is not unique to Vermont. It's used in many different applications. You also have something called a state intercept. And as we're going to look at in the next slide, this is across the country where the majority of school construction finance and credit enhancement lies. It's the structure by which most states use. And the way that works is that if one of our borrowers did not pay us, we would then inform the state treasurer, and via an MOU we have with the state treasurer, they, Treasurer Pichek would then basically have authority to intercept dollars that would be due to that school district from the Vision system, and then redirect it to our trustee who would use that to backfill payments otherwise due. And that actually carries a higher rating from the rating agency perspective than does the moral obligation. And as I'm going to talk about in a second, we haven't sat idly over the past couple of years since our last conversations in 2020. And we've actually done some restructuring to focus on this because it has a higher credit rating, and we can leverage that to reduce our dependence on the moral ob. Because of these two structures, it's just worth noting that we pass along the same cost of capital to all of our borrowers. So the smallest school district versus the largest school district, the wealthiest community versus the least wealthy community, they all have our same cost of capital, basically. And I mentioned before, I said 3.5, it's 3.22% with an average life of approximately 14 years. And then we'll continue to realize savings on that and pass it back to borrowers. So turning to slide 7, this just reiterates the mechanism by which most states use to credit enhance school financing. It's an intercept mechanism. It's what Rhode Island has. So RIBEC is the instrumentality that they use. So RIBEC, which is the Rhode Island Health and Educational Buildings Corporation, they're the ones that both receive the state aid, if you recall from your conversation. They had many programs, but the first iteration of program to support debt service, there's kind of like two buckets, like the community pays debt service, then the state provides that aid to RIBEC. RIBEC then reimburses the borrower, the school district. And then on the intercept side, they have, they have state support that's for operations separate and apart from the housing aid, as they call it, for school construction. And they have the ability to intercept those dollars that then credit enhances their bond issuances. One area where we're above them, just because of the state's GO, we're AA2, Moody's, which just think of like AA flat, and then they are AA3 on their intercept program. So we're one notch ahead. So that's the way most of these intercept programs work. Our good news is ours is already in place. It was part of our founding legislation. So on slide 8, there is one thing I wanted to call your attention to. That is one small shortcoming of our state intercept program. And that is, we're sort of agnostic on this, but it is a consideration as we think about large projects. And that is the fact that, the tax dollars are collected locally. And then, if the community, those dollars that are collected locally and go to the school district, but don't come up to the state, we can't intercept. Like, we can only intercept real dollars that are going down as part of the accounting system. So right now, that's not a problem. There's only, and to receive the enhanced rating, it's essentially best to plan on 2 times coverage. So in other words, dollars that we can intercept from the state are 2 times the amount of debt service that community would pay. Well, because debt service levels are fairly low, there's only 5 of our 53 school district borrowers that are below 2 times currently. But if we just hypothetically said, okay, they're going to take on $30 million of debt and the associated debt service, then that number jumps to 19 of the 53. But on paper, every school district should have like crazy high coverage, right? Because it's coming from technically everything's coming from the ed fund. But because those dollars are transferred at the local level, they aren't subject to the intercept. And therefore, it's a potential shortcoming of the intercept mechanism that we have. So I think, that's just something I'd highlight as a shortcoming. So even if the clerks and treasurers were just to send the money up rather than, they can still collect the money, but if they sent it up to the state and then it came down, that would allow us to get it into the system in a much more clean way than trying to have like some sort of agreement where the banks that they're using allow us to intercept it and we've got 50 different agreements. So that would be kind of a simple solution.
If we were a state that was about to take on a lot more school construction debt, through you. Would that help in terms of bond rating if we
Yeah.
change that intercept issue?
Yes, I think it would be very important.
It's not just a convenience, it's also, it would make a difference.
Oh, yeah,
The bond rating, okay.
for sure. Yeah, I think it would be something we definitely want to consider modifying in some way. And I think that the easiest solution would just be literally to have the clerks and treasurers send it up to the state and have it come down. I know that's a harder conversation than me saying it's simple, but I think there might be, from what I've heard, there might be some, in the context of this school construction discussion, might be some willingness to think through that. So I'm wrapping up here, but I just really wanted to highlight the hard work that we've done over the past couple of years during the COVID times to think through our structure on slide 9 and anticipate what we assume will be a policy role for us to fill in doing school construction finance. We were at the forefront of municipal finance innovation when we were created in 1970, and we're trying to continue to be at the forefront. And one way we've tried to do that is under our current structure, absolutely every bond that we issued is fully backed by the state's moral obligation. Excuse me. And that's not necessarily a problem right now. The rating agencies don't have clear criteria on that. I sit on the Capital Debt Affordability Committee, chaired by the state treasurer, and they have some target levels in which they'd like to see moral obligation. But as I mentioned before, we have $130 million of outstanding school district debt currently. You probably all have guesses as to what this assessment study number is going to look like, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be 130 million. It's going to be in the billions, right? So we wanted to think about ways in which we could anticipate this need without completely exploding the moral obligation requirement. And so what we did, and also lean into that state intercept rating that carries a higher rating than the moral obligation. So we aren't sort of impacting any of our existing borrowers negatively. So what we did is we've started to institute some changes to our general resolution. It's in the weeds, but the way this occurs is like each bond sale we have, those bondholders who buy the new bonds essentially consent to the changes. And so it'll take a couple of years, but when we get that change made, we're going to move to a structure that allows us to reduce the use of the moral obligation by about up to 70%. It will depend upon market conditions, the size of the deal, and a number of other factors with each deal. But it has the potential to significantly reduce our use of the moral obligation while keeping the same rating and also potentially lowering costs for borrowers just because of the structuring of the thing. So the next slide sort of says why we're doing this in a nutshell on page 10, but we're leaning into the state intercept. We're essentially over collateralizing a senior lien that will allow us to maintain the same ratings while reducing use of the moral obligation just on a junior lien. But anyway, I wanted to make sure you all knew that we weren't sitting around and we were anticipating these needs. And we've really moved ourselves into a position where we've at least eliminated one variable from our capacity questions. There are questions of capacity in the markets, what the market conditions look like at that time, how concerned people are about the amount of debt coming from, school districts in Vermont. But those will be somewhat specific to where we look like in a couple of years. And so the last thing I'll say, I didn't include this in the slides and I was kind of remiss in doing so, but we are actively pursuing a pot of funds from the Inflation Reduction Act called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's many parts to it, much discussion, but I think as it matters to this conversation, we view, and those dollars are intended, it's about 27 billion nationally, split up into a $7 billion pot, a $20 billion pot. They're intended for the most part to be relending dollars. So the grants, they're competitive grants that will come down to any type of nonprofit, non-depository lending institution. so not state necessarily, but they're intended to be seed capital for greenhouse gas reduction projects. So we view that as a really critical part of this equation that could really help lower costs. Because if we can get those dollars, we know that there's tremendous, I mean, historically, we've financed dozens of boiler replacements from, oil-based to wood chip or what have you. We've done large energy efficiency upgrades at several schools that were done in consultation with an ESCO. And we've also financed rooftop solar on the school districts themselves. So this is already part and parcel of what we do. And so we view this fund as a potential way to unlock really low cost dollars for those projects and ensure that their operating costs are lower over time because of the reduced energy needs.
Any chance that we'll get a small state minimum?
TBD. EPA, we were like very on the edge of our seat last week, and because we were sort of expecting the final rule from EPA because they had 180 days after the passage of the IRA to come out with it, and they gave us some direction, but not the final rule. The $7 billion pot is intended for zero emissions technologies, primarily solar, residential solar in particular, but also community solar. That may have a small state component to it, but the 20 billion is kind of all takers. So we'll see.
So I'm not very well versed in this area, but when you talk about the lowering of the having to rely on the moral obligation, that means that the other 33% would be the intercept. That's how you fill that.
Yeah, really the 70%, it'll depend on market conditions as to what this ratio looks like. But really, in a vacuum, in a perfect world, the 70% will no longer be relying on the moral ob, just the intercept. Everything will be reliant on the intercept. It stands behind everything, but we won't need the moral ob on the 70%, just the 30%. So it's a much more resource conscious way of using that enhancement.
And the rating agencies like that because the intercept is a real thing, whereas the moral obligation is more of just a concept.
Yeah, it's about a notch. So the intercept has a AA2. The implied rating on the moral ob is probably AA3. So 2 notches off the state's GO, and that's because it's an untested thing and it's subject to budget and appropriation. So it's a little bit more speculative.
We all expect the assessment to come back with a big number.
Yes.
And so if you hear that, okay, here's the state's plan, it's going to be funding $750 million over the next 10 years. Is that where you said, not a chance?
Oh, no. If you said 3 billion, which I think could be a real number, that's
going to be optimistic.
Yeah, that's where I start to get strategic in my thinking, but I don't think the absorption on 750 million over 10 years is, at least given current market conditions and the work that we've done on this, I think that's probably something we could absorb. I mean, the other thing about the way that the school loans have been structured historically is that they amortize really quickly. So, it's not like 750 million is going to be outstanding for that entire period of time. It will pay down quite quickly. So we want to do a lot of planning around the different numbers, but that's a number that seems like it's within the reason of being able to be absorbed.
The treasurer was in yesterday and just sort of talked a bit that with these rating agencies, it's not necessarily just about the math. Sometimes it's about the story.
Yeah.
And is that the
That's right. And I mean, they, in their rating criteria for individual schools, which we don't have, there's only 2 rated entities in the state because of the use of the bond bank, which is the city of Burlington, who typically does their own debt issuance, and Stowe has one, but they don't really use it for any purpose. But in their individual rating criteria for school districts, they look at capital asset depreciation ratios. They just modify their methodology. So that's a great point that the treasurer made, in that if we're saying, okay, our ratios are really high and we're trying to get them back low, here's the period in which we think there's going to be a lot of debt issuance and then it levels off. Like, that's a very good story to tell.
And he was also, addressing some of the concerns that rating agencies had about Vermont, as sort of abstract as demographics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And you can make the case to not ding our rating by saying, we believe that, good schools brings people in.
Right.
And if they listen to things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think fortunately we're in a favorable position. There's some speculation about the number, but showing the population growth over the last decennial period kind of helps tell that story a little bit.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. So
Hi.
looking at bonds for large infrastructure projects, do the interest payments go out of state? And if so, do you think we could cut costs of what we carve out for for-profit banks and reinvest in Vermont?
So let me answer that in two parts.
Yeah.
So on the first part, Vermont is fairly unique. The municipal market is, municipal market is interesting in that about 50% of it is held by the bonds are held by individuals. And that's through a number of mechanisms over the last, over the last 2 decades. It's really largely moved away from individuals holding bonds more to retail type proxies like bond funds or separately managed accounts or other things. But in Vermont, we actually have a really high percentage of, as compared to we've declined, but we have a higher percentage than the market overall in terms of Vermont residents that hold our bonds. So so the benefits, so we like to say we sort of have 2 public goods that we do at the bond bank. One is good investment opportunities, as well as helping facilitate good projects as well. So that's a little bit unique to us, but is within our structure for sure. So, and we've tried to also enhance that. So about a year ago today, we had a smaller deal, and we actually did what's called a direct placement. Looks just like a bank loan, and we did it with a Vermont-based bank. And we're looking for more opportunities to bring in Vermont investors, whatever form they look like, whether they be institutional or retail, as we call it, individual investors. And we've made a big push towards retail investors participating in our bonds at all levels. We brought on some of the online brokerage accounts that are used by maybe not your ultra net worth individual, but maybe your younger person that's just getting started with their investments. We brought them into our selling group so that then they'd have a way to participate. And we don't care if they buy $5,000 worth of bonds. That's meaningful because it's the democratization of our product and is important. So we've done that, and that gives you a sense of sort of where we are. I think your other question leans towards, do we somehow keep it in-house, I guess? And I think that particularly as we look at the size or the scale of what our need is going to be, the municipal market really is what we want to be focused on because it adds leverage. I mean, we're leveraging, finite resources off the state level, but we're able to use the municipal market overall to greatly expand what our capacity is. And so I'd be hesitant to, try to move away from that just because there's a proven track record of being able to absorb municipals and keep costs lower because of the tax exemption as well.
I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks for the presentation, but more importantly, thank you for not sitting idly by while this conversation goes on. No, seriously, and to know that you're thinking about it, the treasurer's office is thinking about it, while we're thinking about it is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, we just don't want to be caught kind of flat-footed when the time comes.
Yeah.
We'll be here and be ready.
Yeah, terrific.
I should also mention, just real quick, I know you're moving on to the next thing. Imminently, we will probably be working with someone to introduce some legislation that would somewhat expand our statute to allow a lot of the energy efficiency projects are equipment-related purchases. And with the low-cost dollars we anticipate as part of these programs, both there's a USDA program as well as this IRA money we're pursuing. We kind of want to meet people where they are in terms of how they finance energy efficiency and renewables. And so right now under statute, there's some limitations on the types of loans we can make. And this would basically just expand our statute to allow us to meet, to do anything that's otherwise allowed in statute for those borrowers. So we think it could also be a part of this equation and important. It's another way in which we're trying to be proactive. So it may be something I reach out to you all about because I think it could be beneficial for the schools also.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Pretty good. Can we push through? You need to be at a meeting, right?
Do you want me to stay here or go to that meeting?
No, you want,
AOE?
yeah, why don't you join? Yeah,
Yeah.
join.
It says there are two. Did they move that?
This is a pre-meeting.
Yeah, this is a pre-meeting,
Then
yes.
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Is that info out of that meeting?
Yeah. All right, Beth, yeah, come on up and join us.
I might have to sneak out at 12:30.
We are hopefully all going to sneak out at 12. All right, so our goal is to go over the miscellaneous education bill today briefly, see if there are any questions, see if folks have any testimony they want to bring in, and then probably have a final discussion of it next week and vote it out. So we get that moving over to the Senate and all that. So Beth is here to walk us through it one more time. We've made a few small additions to it along the way.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. You all should have draft 1.1 in front of you. There's kind of four chunks to it. And the first section is the shared school district data management system. This language should look very familiar to you. It is what we walked through and discussed very earlier in this session that I think you all were hoping to attach to a different vehicle. And then now it is, and that didn't work. And so now it's in your miscellaneous ed bill. Do you want me to walk specifically through all of this language or just give a summary that we are doing away with? Okay.
That, since we've already basically
Okay.
voted it out of committee anyway, yeah.
Okay. It's the exact same language, suspending the implementation of the shared school district data management system, but still allowing the uniform chart of accounts to go forward. So that's page 1, 2, and the very top of page 3. The second category is the National Guard Tuition Benefit Program. I'm on page 3, line 8. It's section 4 of the bill, and it's an amendment to section 2857 in Title 16, which is the Vermont National Guard Tuition Benefit Program. And I included a little bit more language here than we usually include, just to orient you all to what this program is. So it's if a National Guard member meets the eligibility requirements that occur later on in the section that are not germane to this discussion, they're entitled to a tuition benefit for up to full-time attendance. And then this bill is proposing on page 4 to add a new category. And that's for courses at a non-Vermont approved post-secondary education institution approved for federal Title IV funding, which is the financial aid programs, where the degree program is not available in Vermont. So an out-of-state higher ed, but the degree program has to not be available in Vermont. And the benefit that the National Guard member is entitled to is the in-state tuition rate charged by UVM. Any questions? Okay. The next one is a little bit harder to explain because there's lots of changes. So this next section is the home study program. We're on page 4. It's section 5 of the bill. It starts, the reader assistance heading starts on line 10. And this is an amendment to the home study program, which lives under the State Board of Education chapter in Title 16. You'll see 166 is the approved independent school statute, and then 166B is the home study program. And so this, the next few pages that we're going to go through are proposed changes to the home study program. This is it for the home study program as far as regulation. This is the statute. So the recommended changes here are striking that language that you see there on lines 13 through 17. Which, let's see, is kind of simplifying the enrollment process here. So a parent or guardian shall send to the secretary annual notice of intent to enroll the parent's or legal guardian's child in a home study program at least 10 days prior to commencing home study. Such notice, we're going to move on to page 5, shall be submitted via a form developed by AOE. And then there's a few changes on lines 4 through 7 on page 5 to subdivision 2, which is some of the like contact information. So email addresses are being included, telephone numbers of all custodial parents, all custodials being added, and clarifying that the agency is looking for this information from everyone who's legally authorized to make educational decisions for the student. Subdivision 3 is a change. This piece, this requirement, you'll see here, the language that's proposed to be struck is that for each child enrolled during the preceding year, any assessment of progress required under subsection D. You'll see later that subsection D is struck and this concept is put here. And that's how an attestation of academic progress for each child enrolled in the home study program. So it'll be assessed at the end of each school year, and the parent or guardian has to maintain the records. And this language, some of these concepts are in current law, and there's a couple new ones. So the permitted means of assessment shall include a standardized assessment, which may be administered by the local school district or a testing service. The standardized assessment option is in current law. There's a little bit more to current law, but the option of a standardized assessment is in current law. A review of the student's progress by an individual who holds a current Vermont teacher's certificate. That concept is in current law. A parent or guardian report and portfolio to include a summary of what the student learned during the school year and at least 4 samples of student work. The parent portfolio is a concept in current law, but current law does require more than 4 samples of student work. It requires, I believe, samples, and we'll see the language that's been struck, but I believe it requires samples in each of the subject matter standard areas. And then new, and what would be new is that you could show assessment through grades from an online academy or school. And then on page 6, evidence of passing the GED. I'm still on page 6, line 2. This is about how to document disability for if it's a child who's not been previously enrolled in a Vermont school. Current law requires a comprehensive evaluation to establish eligibilities for special ed. It is not required, but it may be ordered by a hearing officer under this section. You'll see below that the hearing process is the proposal is to strike all of that. So the proposed change here is striking that language I just read, and on lines 6 through 8, adding documented disability. So they have to include a documented disability and how the disability may affect the student's educational progress in a home study program. Subdivision 5 on page 6, line 9. The current law requires for each child enrolled in the current year, a detailed outline or narrative that describes the content to be provided in each subject area of the minimum course of study, including any special services or adaptations to be made to accommodate a disability. Methods and materials to be used may be included but are not required. So the proposal here is to strike all of that language and to replace it with a requirement that there is an attestation. I'm on page 14, I'm on line 14, an attestation that each child being enrolled in a home study will be provided the equivalent of at least 175 days of instruction, which is the same for public schools, in the minimum course of study, specifically for a child who is younger than 13 years of age. The subject area is listed in section 906 of this title, which is the minimum course of study section. And for a child who is 13 years of age or older, the subject area is listed in subdivisions 906, subdivision B, 1, 2, 4, and 5 of this title. And then on page 7, at the very top there, subdivision C, For students with documented disabilities, a parent or guardian must attest to providing adaptations to support the student in the home study program. Any questions before I keep going? Okay. Page 6, page 7, line 4, subdivision 6. This bill proposes to repeal the requirement that the contact information and signatures of the people who will be providing the ongoing instruction is provided to AOE. Subdivision 7, a requirement that all parents or legal guardians legally authorized to make educational decisions for the student, the AOE needs their signatures. And then in the alternative, this is the new language proposed, the parent seeking enrollment may provide attestation of sole primary educational decision-making authority. The next subsection is B, page 7, line 12. This is the enrollment notice section. So the change is proposed to, instead of within 14 business days of enrollment, it's 10 business days of receiving the following submission of a complete enrollment notice. AOE or the secretary or designee shall send the home study program a written acknowledgement of receipt, which constitutes sufficient enrollment verifications for truancy purposes. That's the reference section 1121 of this title. And then it repeals all of the other requirements that the acknowledgement previously required. So page 7, subdivision 1, page 8, and subdivision 2 are repealed. Page 8, line 9, subsection C, if a home study student is withdrawing from the program, the parent or guardian shall notify the secretary in writing within 10 business days following the date that any student is withdrawn from the student's home study program. There is, the current law requires that to happen within 7 days instead of 10. And current law also requires the secretary to notify the appropriate superintendent of schools in that district's home, in that student's district or residence, or supervisory union of residents. And you'll see that that is not included in the proposed new language. Subdivision D, starting on page 8, line 16, this is the assessment section that I referred to earlier, that's now earlier in the section, and the proposal here is to repeal all of it. And then on page 9, subsection E, in current law, if AOE or the secretary has information, I'm on page 19, I'm on line 19, has information that creates a significant doubt about whether a home study can or will provide a minimum course of study, then the secretary can ask for a hearing to debate those facts. And the whole hearing process is repealed here. So that's subsection E. And then subsection G is the notice and procedure for that type of hearing, and that is repealed. Subsection H on page 11 is the order that would follow the hearing and the information the order would have had to have contained. That is repealed. And then subsection I is the minimum course of study information. And you'll remember we just went over that earlier. So it was just moved up to a different section, but it's the same requirements for younger than 13 and over 13. The waiver section hasn't changed other than gender neutral change here, getting rid of those pronouns. I'm on page 12, subsection K. This is about the annual notice. So I think it would be helpful to just look at the proposed new language on page 13. A parent or guardian who's provided a complete enrollment notice as described in subsection A of this section shall notify the secretary on or before the start of each following year of the parent or guardian's intention to continue to provide instruction through a home study program. This notice shall be provided at least 10 business days prior to the intended start of the home study program. Let's see, I'm just looking at the current law language. Current law says that if you have successfully completed the last 2 consecutive school years of home study, you don't have to continue to submit an annual requirement. And so this proposal is just saying you complete one on or before the start of each year, of each following year of the intent to continue in it. And then subsection L is repealed, and this is a requirement that there's an annual submission of a description of special services and adaptations if those are necessary. That's home study. And then the last topic is the Vermont Ethnic and Social Equity Standards Advisory Working Group, and pushing out some of their, the dates tied to their recommendations and reporting requirements. So on page 13, starts on line 17, but section 6 of this bill is amending Act 1, which was already amended in 2021. So if you go to page 14, you'll see there that on line 7, the working group shall review standards for student performance adopted by the state board in on or before current law had December 31st, 2021. This is pushing their recommendations. So they're supposed to make recommendations to the state board. Pushed out to June 30th, 2023. Their reporting requirement on lines 13 and 14, current law is that the working group shall submit a report to the General Assembly by December 31st of 2022, pushing that date out to June 30th, 2023. And then the State Board of Education is required to consider adopting ethnic and social equity standards. That date again was December 31st, 2022, pushing that date out for their consideration to December 31st, 2023. And then on page 15, there's a change to the appropriation. This is a little unusual. So that the ask is that they were appropriated a little bit of money, I believe for per diems, and any unused portion of those appropriations, current law says that they would automatically revert to the general fund on July 1, 2022, which is a date in the past. So has that money reverted?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not sure it's per diem money.
Okay.
We had appropriated money for them to hire a consultant if they were unable to get what they needed through the Agency of Education.
Okay. It was a very small sum. It was like $3,000, which is why I thought it was per diem. But I can certainly look it up. Either way, if the money's reverted back to the general fund, this language is going to do nothing.
Okay.
So if they need more money,
all right,
that would be a whole new appropriation. If the money hasn't reverted and someone's just holding it somewhere waiting,
yes,
then I suppose this language would work.
Okay. I guess we better follow up and find out where that money is hanging out.
Yes. And then the effective dates, just really quickly, I have everything taking effect on July 1, 2023, except for those dates, kicking them out. I have taking effect on passage. So it's some of that because they occur in June, some of them. So July 1, 2023 is not going to do you any good.
Any questions? Yes.
Were we not going to include the pre-K voucher for students that have to cross the border to?
We were not, because that's a big topic. Because the current law says that money only goes to pre-K programs that adopt the Vermont Early Learning Standards. And so, we would need, that would be a bill in and of itself. to adjust that. We haven't found that there is an equivalent to the VELS that would meet that same standard of accountability that exists there.
So we would have to present a bill.
Yeah, I mean, we can create a committee bill. It's just that I think what we sort of discovered is that we have two very different systems with very different accountability and requirements. And so there's going to be a lot of people who have a lot of different opinions on the matter.
Okay.
Beth, the home study section, talking about the content, is that unusual to have something that long in a miscellaneous ed bill?
No,
I mean, it's
prior miscellaneous ed bills I've seen have been, a lot of them have been over 60 pages. So, no.
I just meant the level of change, quantity of changes of different topics.
No, you're making this a miscellaneous bill, so you can make whatever changes you want in there. I think it would be a policy decision if you want to group it in with things or pull it out.
Anything else, committee? I think when we're ready to vote it out, we'll have fun with presenting it on the floor, in that we'll break it up. And if folks want to volunteer to do one section or another, let me know. Otherwise, I will be assigning them. Beth, I think that's what we got.
Okay, I'm just trying, I have act
Is our
one up.
miscellaneous ed bill better than the Senate's? Could you comment on that?
Could I answer that question? No.
No, you gotta answer the question and no, it's not better.
Plead the fifth.
Okay.
Let's see. I'll get out of here. I'm trying to find that money piece, but we do, I don't know if you want to follow up on figuring out, who's following up on figuring out where the money is? Am I awaiting direction, or is that something that I need to do?
I could probably find it faster. Because I don't have as many things to do. Would you?
I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, I would first start with the working group.
Yeah.
For their understanding of where that money is.
That, and then also, I think with the AOE's money people. Yeah, I'll put out an email and just.
Okay.
Fine, yeah, thanks. Committee will consider ourselves done for the day, for the week. Those of you who are left, thank you.